Thank you to the organisers for inviting me to speak, and I am really sorry that I can't be with you in person. I really regret not being able to meet you all, and I also regret not having the opportunity to travel to Iceland and get to know some of the places where you work. But I really want to begin by saying that, as you might have gathered from Katherine's introduction, I don't actually work on tourism, and I was initially a little bit surprised by the invitation. For most of my career, I've worked in Peru, most recently as an ethnographer of state practice, particularly infrastructure projects and primarily road building. However, for the past 5 years or so, I've worked on the nuclear industry in the UK. And my work on nuclear power began with an interest in decommissioning and the ways in which social worlds are dismantled in the process of decommissioning. So, if you like, in more general terms, I'm interested in placemaking and how specific environments come into being and transform over time. And it's here that I find all kinds of overlaps and intersections between my research and the broad research worlds of tourism studies. So although it might appear that nuclear power and tourism don't have that much in common, there are some unexpected intersections that I want to explore today and hopefully open up a space for conversation. So I just want to check, is the PowerPoint on, or do I have to do something else?
Can you please share your screen again?
Oh, okay. Sorry, everybody. Wasn't ready for that. Right, here we go. Okay. There we go. So this is a place where I've been working, and I'll tell you more about in a moment. But I just wanted to start by referring to what I've picked up from the basic conference theme. So these are the issues that I'm trying to address in this paper about shaping mobile futures, and particularly this question about how to build decent conditions for life in the Anthropocene. And I really like this more specific question that was raised about whether tourism, with its ever-expanding infrastructures, commodifications and circulations, can ever be anything other than part of the problem, and if so, how? Now, these questions are asked of the tourism and hospitality industries in the framing of this conference, but I think they can equally be asked of industry in general. And I should also say that there are clearly no straightforward answers to these questions. But this framing does provide a point of convergence for us, not least, I think, in the foundational tension between the promise and the threat of industrial growth and development. And these tensions between promise and threat are perhaps nowhere more dramatically rehearsed than with the promise and the threat of nuclear energy, where the fear of apocalyptic disaster accompanies the promise that technological innovation might possibly deliver a safe, reliable and plentiful replacement for fossil fuels. Today, the UK industry makes much of its green credentials, as this kind of promotional slide from the EDF website shows. The nuclear industry thinks very centrally about its role in reducing the UK's carbon footprint and its capacity to sustain socio-economic life both locally and nationally. So I think it's a good moment to ask whether the nuclear industry can ever be anything other than part of the problem. And while I can't answer this question, obviously your invitation has provoked me to think about the divergent understandings of decent conditions for life that I came across in a place where industry and tourism have long coexisted. So I'm going to begin just by introducing you to the field sites where I'm working and the stories that people have told me that reveal something about how decent conditions for life are understood, apprehended and negotiated in the everyday. So this map, just really to orient you to show where I'm working down at Hinkley Point in Somerset, that you can see down there at the bottom. And I've been doing field work there in and around Hinkley Point nuclear complex. There are 3 power stations at Hinkley Point, and this map kind of helps in a more local orientation to see. So at the top there is where the Hinkley Point power stations are, and I'm going to be talking about these other ringed areas at other points in the talk, and I'll come back to the map to tell you about them. So just to show you the power stations, the one on the left that looks as though it's got the kind of rather smiley faces on it, this is Hinkley Point A. And Construction on this plant began in 1957, very soon after the end of the war, obviously, and it was operational from 1965 until 2000. It's no longer operational, it's being decommissioned. Hinkley Point B began to be built only a decade after Hinkley Point A, and construction began there in 1967, and it's been operational since 1976. It's still operational, but closure is imminently on the horizon, currently planned for next year in 2022. And then planning consent for Hinkley Point C was granted in 2013. And I'm just leaving this slide up momentarily because Hinkley Point C is appearing on these nice green fields that you can see next to the other two power stations. And this is a view of Hinkley Point C, which is owned by EDF, the French, large French utility company. And it's been constructed since 2018, and it's going to probably be operational somewhere between 2025 and 2027. I should say that EDF also own Hinkley Point B, so they're running the power stations in this place. Now, EDF is a very interesting company in many ways. And one of the things I've picked up on my fieldwork is that they make a very conscious effort to establish themselves as good neighbours in West Somerset. And they draw attention to the many infrastructures, large and small, that demonstrate their support for local communities. So this map here, which comes off their website, shows the ways in which they built bypasses around small towns so that they improve the roads in the local area. They've also done a lot for building new housing facilities for all the thousands of workers. And of course, they're providing thousands of jobs, tens of thousands of jobs for people right across the country, but very particularly in the southwest. They have training facilities and a lot of localized improvements in small ways. So they kind of put double glazing into people's houses, and they've provided sports fields. And here in the village where I've been working in Stagursey, they've completely rebuilt their village hall. So if you like, there's a visible effort to ensure that the infrastructure systems that keep the power station going sit along systems that make places habitable, which is a term I'm going to work with and come back to shortly. So that, if you like, they have all kinds of efforts to make life more livable. And these include efforts around environmental protection, as well as the well-being of human beings. And safety is the massive mantra all the time, so that they're very aware that should anything appear to be unsafe, that would not be, they would be much less welcome as neighbours. So I'm kind of trying to show that they brings us back to the issues of sustainability and how to build decent conditions for life in the Anthropocene. So I thought maybe I should say a little bit more about the Anthropocene itself as a concept before moving on to the more ethnographic section. So the Anthropocene, as I'm sure you know, is a popular term used to refer to the intrusion of the human into its own condition of being. It refers to a growing awareness that the natural world does not stand outside and beyond human life. The traces of human life are now geological. But the Anthropocene refers to something more than a physical trace. It refers to a reflexive awareness of mutual vulnerability, a sense of limited resources, and of the potentially catastrophic disruption to the wider systemic life support systems which have been thrown out of balance, perhaps irrevocably. This fragility is felt acutely with respect to tourism, particularly those forms of tourism that rely on fossil fuels, or those that encourage people to escape industrial centres to explore remote areas of outstanding natural beauty. West Somerset has several important nature reserves, and it has areas that are protected from development initiatives. And yet, of course, it also has these power stations. Indeed, the relative remoteness of the Hinkley site was a key factor in the siting process. It's located at a distance from centres of population and by the sea for the convenience of access to water for the cooling systems. So this juxtaposition of industry in the natural world brings me back to this concept of habitability that I just mentioned. This is a term that Dipesh Chakrabarty introduces in his book on climate change. Habitability is a term that invites us to think about decent conditions for life on a planetary scale, beyond the human. And these are his words that I put up there. It's habitability. The central concern of habitability is life, complex multicellular life in general, and what makes life, not humans alone, sustainable. So he's constantly trying to think beyond the concerns of human life. He points out that the habitability of the planet involves a whole range of relationships and proximities, many of which humans are not even aware of. So this inevitable lack of awareness encapsulates the fundamental challenge of the Anthropocene, but it also draws attention to the need to think in new ways about relational dynamics. And here's where I came to Kath Weston's really interesting work on eco-intimacies. And this is the cover of her book. I'm not sure how much you can see the subtitle, but it's called Animate Planet, Making Visceral Sense of Living in a High-Tech, Ecologically Damaged World. It's also then, eco-intimacies is a concept that's also inviting us to think beyond human relations. It's a concept, however, that is grounded in everyday life, with a focus on effective, even visceral engagement with transforming environments. And these are environments that are both intimately known and yet at the same time ultimately unknowable. These eco-intimacies of industrial environments create spaces of encounter and entanglement that may or may not be technologically mediated and may or may not involve direct proximity to particularly hazardous sites. So here's a kind of close-up of Hinkley Point B, where you could imagine that the eco-intimacy of being right alongside this power station may feel very overwhelming. But the eco-intimacy could also be at a distance. This is very, very proximate to the site, but this is actually a quite important bird sanctuary where all kinds of plant and animal life is thriving quite happily along at some distance from the power station. So eco-intimacies, for better or worse, are registered in basic environmental terms, in noise level, dust, soils, watercourses, in the quality of air and of light, and in the sensibilities of safety and or danger, in the fauna and the flora, in the radioactive waste, and in the electricity. So eco-intimacies are not necessarily cozy, but they are fundamental to evaluations of the quality of life, and thus to any consideration of how decent conditions for life itself might be understood and enacted. So having kind of basically introduced these two concepts of habitability and eco-intimacy, I'm now going to give you two more detailed ethnographic examples. The first one describes the vulnerabilities of urban industrial lives and livelihoods from the perspective of a long-term resident in the town of Bridgewater, which was kind of the nearest town to Hinkley Point. And the second looks at life in a rural village right on the perimeter fence of Hinkley Point and the ambivalent relationship that people have to industry and the transformations that it brings about. Both the urban and the rural settings are marked by diverse forms of mobility and belonging, of sensibilities to place, inflected by distinctions between hosts and guests, and divergent understanding of what it means to be a good neighbour. What I want to suggest in this presentation is that the challenge of the Anthropocene is fundamentally about finding new ways to live together with others, both human and non-human. A focus on neighbourliness and the host-guest relation opens up the complexity of the relational dynamics that these deeply unstable categories imply. So my next section is called Place and the Biographic Scale. And I begin in the town of Bridgewater. My friend Anne had invited her colleague to talk about his working life. Rob, now in his late 60s, had a long career of involvement in the town council, and he's been the mayor of Bridgewater 3 times. The stories that he told me ranged across a whole gamut of working relationships. His mother had worked at the Cellophane. British Cellophane, that's what the company Cellophane was officially called, set up their factory in Bridgewater in 1937. In World War II, it was requisitioned to produce munitions, and then after the war, it went back to producing cellophane. By the 1970s, over 3,000 people were employed there. Everybody knew somebody or was related to somebody who worked there. Rob kind of rather enjoyed telling us that he'd resisted his mother's attempts to persuade him to take up the jobs that she'd found for him through her contacts and local influence. He'd prefer to go elsewhere. Perhaps it was too overwhelmingly familiar for him to want to work there as well. So he'd worked in a slaughterhouse and then in a coal yard, unloading the coal that came in to the docks from Wales. But the last coal came in 1969, and the business closed in 1971. His stories were stories of unionised labour and of search for jobs that guaranteed a degree of overtime, jobs that were secure enough to enable a worker to get a mortgage and buy a house. The cellophane factory had come to Bridgwater in the 1930s, when unemployment in the area was extremely high, and the low wages that people were prepared to offer in Bridgwater undercut possibilities elsewhere in the country. But these were jobs that came and went, and by the 1990s things were closing down. Rob listed some of the iconic UK brands that had shut down their operations in the area. You might have heard of some of them: Cadbury's, the chocolate factory; Clark's, the shoemaker; Taunton and Blackthorn cider. The cellophane itself was sold in the 1980s and closed altogether shortly afterwards. Rob told his stories, though, with more than a hint of ironic nostalgia. The closures displaced times of greater sociability and prosperity, where large workforces employed families across the generations, and where workers came to think of themselves as family. These were times when a sense of personal value and of belonging was produced from the dark but nevertheless familiar and relatively stable environment of the 1950s, in which worker citizens were seen as integral to the rebuilding of the world after the devastations of the 1940s. Rob referred to the sites that generated the powerful and effective eco-intimacies of former times as the deadly triangle of the Royal Ordnance Factory, which was the munitions work, the cellophane, and Hinkley Point A. I've lost count of the numerous people who told me with some affection of the distinctive stench of the cellophane factory. It smelt, but it was the smell of a place that they belonged to. There was also a sense of pleasure and enjoyment taken in accounts of previous accidents, such as when the jam factory emptied 2 full road tankers of tomato puree that had gone beyond its sell-by date directly into the River Parrett. And this is the tidal river that runs through the middle of Bridgwater, so the red sludge was swept out on the tide, only to come back in again for days on end. Jobs and industrial development then came hand in hand with the smells, toxicities, and the lack of any semblance of environmental care. The glossing over of pollution and its detrimental effects was also visible in accounts of the fluctuating employment regimes that brought many different waves of migrant labour to the town over the years, particularly seasonal agricultural labour, but also the labour needs of large construction projects that came and went with the staggered arrival of the power stations. Differentiations between insiders and outsiders were strongly marked, and identities were configured around families, workplaces, pubs, local towns, and the dividing lines of regional accents and religious affiliations. My friend Anne remembered a sign on one of the more respectable pubs in the town, very much in inverted commas there, that read, "No travellers, no dogs, no gypsies." These exclusions that are remembered today with amusement by some were, of course, once the basis of harsh, discriminatory exclusions. The marking of difference, then, between insiders and outsiders were also fundamental to another aspect of Bridgwater that Rob was very passionate about, and these are the carnival clubs and the pubs. Oh dear. These are the carnival clubs and the pubs that house them. Carnival is a complex topic in its own right, but in brief, the origins of the Bridgwater Carnival go back to the 5th of November 1605, when Guy Fawkes, who was a Catholic, and his co-conspirators attempted to blow up the Houses of Parliament in London. They were caught in the act, and Parliament decreed that the successful defence of this most central of national institutions should be celebrated annually with the lighting of bonfires. And this is a tradition that, with various ebbs and flows, including the ebbs and flows of anti-Catholic sentiment, still continues until today, although now it's got rather merged with a kind of US-style Halloween, but November the 5th is a strange British custom. In West Somerset alone, there are over 40 carnival clubs who compete to produce huge illuminated vehicles. Sorry, my PowerPoint is not. So yeah, this is basically 100-foot-long vehicle that's just so lit up and decorated that you lose all sense of the vehicle itself. So these vehicles, referred to as carts, process through 6 different towns to raise money for charity. The carts are 100 foot long and highly decorated with lights, music and dancers. The leading clubs spend upward of £40,000 on each entry, and a year of intensive collaborative effort to raise the funding, produce the design, build the cart, and of course perfect the decoration and the dancing. Rob had mentioned so many different names and places in this conversation that we were left somewhat dizzy, and he suggested that he could take us on a tour to better connect these stories to the town itself. A week or so later, we'd taken him up on the offer. But despite the earlier enthusiasm, Rob seemed reticent. What did we want to see exactly, he asked us. Well, we reminded him that he'd suggested he would show us around. Yes, he said, but the places aren't there anymore. I can show you somewhere, but it will have been built over. The old workplaces have closed down and replaced with new housing. Eventually, however, encouraged by assurances that we were very interested in him showing things that weren't there anymore, we set off in his car to look around. He was right, it was quite disorienting. The housing estates and new industrial zones that we were driving through were disconnected from the names and the places and the memories that structured the route that he was taking. Some emblematic sites remained, such as the old brickworks and Brunel's Black Bridge, which are now significant heritage sites. But Rob and Anne themselves seemed quite unfamiliar with the places they were taking me to. They were surprised by how extensive these zones were and by the range of activities. All kinds of light engineering, a small cement works, a fiberglass manufacturer. What had once been a very familiar world of large employers, substantial plant and unionized labour had been replaced by numerous small units, probably employing only about 10 or 12 people each. The residential areas were even more anonymous and no longer integrated by the shared workplace or the collective rhythms of factory shifts. We, in turn, were looking at these places from inside the car, listening to an account of what used to be there, but with very little information to go on in terms of how these worlds had been reconfigured. From inside the car, we heard a narrative of loss and displacement. Things changed when we got out of the car. Adrian took us to a site where the carnival carts are currently being built. This is a relatively new site that the council had found and in which many of the carnival clubs had invested by erecting warehouses in which they could work on the carts throughout the year, whatever the weather. The season of the carnival parades was over and the site was quiet, but the unbuilding of that year's carts was underway. There were kind of surreal piles of discarded materials, tins of paint, bits and pieces stripped off and put to one side. Although not busy, there were people there, and Rob introduced us to his friend Barry, who was at work in one of the hangars. He told us that he worked in transport logistics, but that day he was on a late shift, so he'd come down in the morning to get stuff done. He liked working on the cart when there weren't too many other people there. His skills were in engineering and robotics, and his passion was to make sure that the ancient vehicle on which the next elaborate illuminated display would be constructed would be fit for purpose. Back in the car, we drove out to the levels. So now this is kind of down in the bottom right-hand corner where it says Weston Zoyland. That's fully the levels. This is the coastal plain and hugely biodiverse wetlands that surround Bridgewater. This is a place where the Battle of Sedgemoor was fought and lost in 1685. The battle was an unsuccessful attempt by the Duke of Monmouth, who was the illegitimate son of Charles II, to seize the throne of England from his uncle, James II. The power struggle was fought out in those days in arm-to-arm combat, motivated by fundamental and disputed claims over who were legitimate insiders and who were outsiders. Bridgewater had backed the wrong side. The defeat was absolute, and the reprisals were bloody. The narrative of this event is still integral to the identity of Bridgewater and is commemorated as an event in many local sites and museums, but also in the sensibilities that register a marginality with respect to English centres of power. The Levels also speaks of histories of environmental engineering and the reclaiming of land from the sea that began in the Middle Ages. Flood control is still an issue, and devastating floods, such as those that happened quite recently, register another mode of eco-intimacy that residents remain continually aware of, an eco-intimacy that resonates with a sense of vulnerability and abandonment by central government, that really kind of seems to have its roots way back before, earlier even than the 17th century. These environmental and political histories are some of the issues that have to be considered when asking the question of how to build decent conditions for life in the Anthropocene in this specific time and place. So now I'm going to move you up to Stegursey, which if you take a kind of diagonal line up to the left of the screen, you can find the village of Stegursey. In the rural villages beyond Bridgewater and closer to the Hinkley Point complex, the arrival of the power station was registered in quite different ways than it was in Bridgewater. I lived for several months in the village of Stegursey, which is located right on the perimeter fence of the Hinkley Point complex. Older residents remember the arrival of Hinkley Point A. Mary was born in Stegursey in the 1920s. She told me that before the first power station was built, life revolved around the Fairfield estate, which was owned by Lord St Audrey's, who owned also most of the houses in the village. He looked after people, and most people worked on his estate. There were shops for all their basic needs, and there was never a reason to go into Bridgewater, except perhaps once a year for the carnival or the horse fair. She said that Stegursey had changed all of a sudden and was never the same after the arrival of the Hinkley A workforce. She, like Rob, was nostalgic for earlier times when everybody knew each other. Everybody went to church on Sundays, and even if they didn't all go to the same church, people watched each other to know whether they had gone to one or the other. And they also lived alongside each other with similar routines and rhythms. It's not Stegursey anymore. It's not Stegursey anymore, she told me. It's just a part of Hinkley. And when pressed to explain that, she said that the place had just become unfamiliar. People don't conform to what were once common values. She didn't put it in those terms. What she said, it's just traffic. People have cars and they don't put them away because they don't have garages. And her account had suggested that was a certain loss of respectability. Julia was someone else I talked to, someone who also came to the village, but with her husband in the 1960s. He was a mechanical engineer and was employed at Hinkley Point A. They left and subsequently returned in the 1970s when the construction of Hinkley Point B began. Julia also talked about the tremendous shock of Hinkley A. There was no preparation for it, she said, no accommodation. Even the more skilled workers had to live in caravans. She also talked about the houses with no garages and a certain discomfort with finding herself an outsider and forced to live in accommodation that didn't match her own sense of respectability. Her account reveals an attunement to class status that is so frequently managed through these kinds of accommodation to specific but always exclusionary social and cultural norms. She said that since the 1960s, the village was divided between those who'd lived there before Hinkley and those who arrived after. Like Mary, she had found Lord St Audrey's to be a benevolent landlord, but she added that when she arrived, Stegursey was basically a medieval peasant community. The arrival of Hinkley Point A had catapulted the village into the 20th century. All the younger men left farming and plunged the rural economy into disarray. The impact of Hinkley Point B was less dramatic, but did cement these transformations. The school was overwhelmed by the influx of new residents. The bakery went bankrupt, and then the grocery store. Soon all the shops had closed. The village had moved into a world that outcompeted them. And now, with Hinkley Point C, the disruptions discussed are all about the traffic. These brief accounts of rural transformation are not unique to the new nuclear industry. In many ways, they're reminiscent of the famous work by Ronald Blythe that described the changes in agricultural life in Akenfield, an English village in the county of Suffolk, from the turn of the century to the 1960s. Blythe's account focused on the industrialisation of agriculture itself and the changing dynamics of rural life, particularly in the post-war period, when young people increasingly gravitated towards the cities in search of work, while the urban middle classes began to seek out second homes or places to live in retirement in the countryside. These incoming residents were not in search of work. They tended to have their own transport and they weren't reliant on public services or even local shops. In the villages adjacent to the Hinkley Point complex, the transformations of the 1950s were somewhat different because Hinkley Point itself had jobs and very well paid jobs. So long-term residents were not necessarily leaving the area. On the contrary, they were having to adjust to the new arrivals. Nevertheless, these transformations, like those in Suffolk, were shot through with class tensions and with an emerging ambiguity over whose place this now was. As the years passed, the distinctions between insiders and outsiders became blurred. Who were the guests? and who were the hosts. I want to round off this section with a brief reference to the Lake District poets, as promised in my abstract, William Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge, both of whom had lived in West Somerset for some time at the very start of the 19th century. I wanted to refer to them because their poetry pretty much gave birth to nature tourism in the UK, and in the process set the stage for the enduring tension between the opposing values of industrial progress and external wild nature. Wordsworth's poetry was famed for its eloquent promotion of the value of sublime nature and its restorative spiritual effects. But he was writing this at the height of the Industrial Revolution, and technological change was reconfiguring future horizons. Wordsworth led the protest against the incursion of a new railway line that was linking Manchester to the Lake District. He wrote letters and poems, and as Harriet Ritvo, the historian, put it, he was especially worried about the damage that might be done to the Lake District by the flood of impecunious tourists for whom the region would become newly accessible. His protests had little effect, not least because of the enduring power of his own poetry. People were drawn to the area not simply by the natural beauty of the place, but by the way in which the lake poets had identified, described, and packaged that beauty. The places that these poets had visited and described, their homes and haunts, were curated as routes for tourists to visit, as they are in Somerset. Wordsworth himself, surprisingly, even wrote a guidebook which was published anonymously, orienting people to the specific delights of the region. Ritvo tells us that he remained openly ambivalent about Lake District tourism and his own role in promoting it. The struggle to reconcile the tension between an external nature and a relational nature continues to shape contemporary discussions of the Anthropocene and to raise important challenges for any consideration of how decent conditions for life are understood, apprehended, and negotiated in the everyday. Negotiations in his day that for the first time began to actually include poor urban workers who found they had new rights to leisure and to travel. More recently, the transformations that have taken place in villages like Stegursey are also marked by the qualitative transformations of local ecologies. Ecologies that include agricultural practices and environments, but also a whole range of other things, including who your neighbours are, whether you know them or not, the kinds of houses that people live in, the differential distribution of access to goods and services, and the sense that there is no longer a common sensibility to the appropriate use of public or shared spaces. The power of class tensions, among many other finer-grained understandings of decent conditions for life, continue to play out today in the concerns that people have about other people's cars, the fears that they have about further housing developments, and the ongoing sense that this place is no longer their own. It's important to note, however, that the Hinkley Point power stations are now basically assumed as a given in the local area. I've come across very few people in Stegursey who actively object to the power stations. Some have told me that they would prefer it if they weren't there, but they are there, and if they weren't there, then something else would be. Standing in a field, when out for a walk with a local friend, we look out over the construction site of Hinkley Point C. And my friend says, it could have been Pontins. Pontins is the company that introduced relatively cheap and popular holiday camps in the UK in the 1940s. These camps combine self-catering residential units with a whole range of entertainment facilities. I felt that there was more than an echo of Wordsworth's sentiments about the threat of working-class recreation and the implication that the nuclear power stations had probably been a better option. These kinds of comments suggest that Hinkley Point has in some respects established its own neighbourhood. The mobilities of labour and of materials that it provokes continue to raise concerns, but these perhaps seem more contained, and EDF is at the same time more answerable to the local population than would maybe have been the case if a large tourism developer had arrived and produced an ever-expanding resort. So I have a concluding section called Industry, Tourism and Neighbourly Relations. I return again to the question then of how to build decent conditions for life in the Anthropocene. In this talk, I've tried to draw attention to a context of shifting perspectives between industry and local people, between local people themselves, between notions of locality, between incomers and longer-term residents, between migrants and established families. In this context, EDF casts itself as both host to its own fluctuating workforce and as a guest in realization that the longest time that they're ever going to be there, which is the lifetime of the PowerPoint, will probably be about 60 years. At the same time, EDF strives to manage the ambiguities in the hierarchies of the host-guest relation by referring to itself as a good neighbour. Reflection on the host-guest relation and the sense that this relation is both mutual and unequal made me reflect on how the claim to be a good neighbour could perhaps be seen as an attempt to assert some common ground. EDF are clearly invested in finding ways to become integral to the place, to be both a welcoming host and a good neighbour. A small visitor centre housed in a shopping mall in central Bridgewater organises tours of the site, open to all. Excuse me. But local communities are specifically invited to join and to come regularly to see how the project is progressing. Some of these tours take people around the construction site in coaches with commentary on the scale and the ambition of the project and its impressive groundbreaking technologies. This technology tourism, which is indeed fascinating to local residents, is designed to produce more intimate relations with visitors. The cranes all have names and genders, and there are competitions that run in local schools to choose new names for new pieces of kit. The company also runs walking tours in the summer. Here the emphasis is on environmental restoration, care and improvement. They've protected this woodland, which is literally abuts right onto the site. They've also built all kinds of facilities for badgers, bats and snakes designed for their protection. The trees and the plants flourish in managed woodlands and meadows. Eco-diversity is celebrated and enumerated. However, it's hard to perform neighbourliness from behind the securitized fences and barriers that separate the power stations from the wider neighbourhood. I've been interested to find that most of the struggles and complaints made by those who live alongside Hinkley Point have to do with frustrations around issues which people feel they're both deeply impacted by and yet which they have little ability to change. Residents are frequently asked to respond to consultations, and there are many meetings when they can lodge complaints and concerns, but they are never integral or equal parties to the decision-making. In this sense, they're cast as outsider, a sense that Mary expressed in her terms of displacement. It's not Stagursey anymore, it's just a part of Hinkley. There are several key issues of controversy that residents continually complain about and raise in all the meetings they have with EDF. And at the moment, these include the movement of nuclear waste, the disposal of sediments that some fear could be toxic, the possible removal of a fish deterrent on the cooling system that raised concerns about ecosystems and environmental protection. But what people actually mention on a daily basis is the noise from heavy vehicles and machinery, the lights on the construction site that are never turned off, and the parking that leaves people displaced from their own sense of being able to arrive home. These are all issues that exemplify the displacement produced by a colonizing and powerful external force. However, when it comes to Carnival, these very same issues are exaggerated and celebrated. Carnival is noisy, smelly and risky, and all the better for it. Thousands of people line the streets, often waiting in the rain for a good spot from which to watch the carts pass by, lights glaring, music blaring, and with rather dodgy, gendered and sexualized carnivalesque gyrations in full swing on the carts themselves. After the procession, key members of the Bridgewater clubs conclude the event with a handheld firework display known as squibbing. Oh dear. Here we go. This is a squibbing, which is somewhat but not completely controlled, and the general public push against the flimsy ropes that separate them from the fireworks, and the sparks just rain down on top of everybody. Participation is very clearly at your own risk, as this sign reminds everybody. These are moments of visceral eco-intimacy, but they're ones that inspire local pride in the event. The power of the carnival ultimately rests with this intense participatory sociality, led by the ethos of the clubs, fueled by competition, and involving a cross-section of people bound together by passionate allegiances and shared memories of extravagant drunken deeds of daring and idiocy. The carnival certainly does not pretend to be anything other than part of the problem. It does not even articulate the problem. The event is in many ways a homage to electricity and to the skills of engineering, design, and electronics. But it is also a creative and impressive response to the conditions of life in a town where socio-economic vulnerabilities and fluctuations threaten to undo families and familiarities. In this sense, it's an intensely social project. Replayed year after year, it binds people to place, both in the intense competition between clubs, between the towns that participate, and to each other in the collaborations that are involved in putting on the show, and to the charitable offshoots that embed the carnival in the wider community. As Victor Turner taught us many decades ago, carnivals are social dramas and cultural performances that enact reversals by producing a liminal time and space in which people come together and relate other ways in ways that are not confined by established norms. Perhaps the particular way in which carnival turns everything on its head, and not only in the moment of performance, is the way in which life is engaged on a single plane of intimate coexistence that contrasts very starkly with EDF's controlled and deliberate attempts to present itself as a good neighbour. The good neighbour in the register of carnival is not really the person you get on with or the one you take care to not unduly annoy or inconvenience, although these kind of sentiments are visible. Perhaps the good neighbour is already too abstract a term. Club members forge a different and far more visceral kind of intimacy, more akin to the familiarity of those who work together on the industrial sites of the Deathly Triangle. I've come to see the intimacy of the carnival as a significant expression of industrial life, involving effervescent moments that subsequently transform into the glue that people carry forward into what are ultimately highly ordered initiatives to create and sustain social bonds in places where neither the state nor industry can be relied upon to care for the marginal, as good neighbours should. This idiom of the good neighbour then provokes me to a final reflection on how decent conditions for life in the Anthropocene rest on the quality of relations, qualities that have ultimately to be worked out again and again in the everyday, across scales, and through specific embodied modes of participation. I want simply to suggest that these practices of visceral connection are useful tools for connecting Chakrabarty's distinction between sustainability and habitability as people work to reconcile their concerns with the mobilities of both human and other than human futures. Thanks.